Hey everyone, it's been a while since I've actually covered a sideboard guide for Dash. The last time I covered it was during the mid-range version of the list, which was a pretty long time ago. A lot of things are very different. And now with the change in meta as well as the change in deck list, it feels pretty important to actually go back and just quickly run through all the matchups that currently exist now in the classic constructed format, especially now that a few extra heroes have Living Legend at this point. So we have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to go through this as quickly as possible. Just try to make this a little bit easier. Tier lists are, once again, not always super helpful to understanding things, and if I could, I would take the time, I had extra time of course, to make a longer sort of slider and have bad matchups on one end and then good matchups on the other end. I think that would be an easier way to break this up. So we're going to kind of break it down. These are obviously like not super helpful to fully understanding it, but it may give us a better idea of where we're going to land on certain matchups. So the difference between free and concede are probably not that big of a deal. It maybe is like a 20% win rate kind of thing. But regardless, we're going to start with Kano here. So Kano, we can look at a deck list very quickly. So if we look at this right here, there's a few things, right? Kano's going to kind of play a little bit more of a tempo to combo style deck. This one right here seems more in on the combo version as we see Ragamuffins. And the first thing we need to consider, first of all, is whether or not we want to be on one of two game plans in the Dash list. The new hybrid build is very simple because either we're on the fully aggressive version of the deck, or we're going to be running 100% mech cards in our main board and we're going to be boosting as much as we can, or are we going to be on this control-y mid-range pistol plan where we're going to block and preserve life total, set up our pistol engine to then shoot a bunch of times for an increased amount of damage with the Teklo pistol late game, and eventually grind out the game in that fashion. So when we look at Kano, there's really no reason for us to go to the late game against him. If we go to the late game, he'll have the ability to set up a very strong combo with Tunic, with whatever card he wants in Arsenal, maybe multiple E-Pots, Potion of Deja Vu, and Aether Wildfire ready to go, probably from Arsenal. So if we wait too long, we actually don't really get anywhere against Kano. And the best way that we can attack Kano is by being aggressive as possible. The first thing we need to look at is his life total being only at 30. He has almost no blocking on equipment. A lot of these cards either block for 2, and sometimes block for 3, but he really doesn't have the ability to actually fully block out a lot of our turns, which also means we're not concerned about fatigue. That's going to be something that comes up a lot. People have opted to full block the boost version of Dash, and because of that, she's run into a lot of issues where she'll actually fatigue very easily. So because of that, into a lot of these aggro matchups today, we're going to be running Induction Chamber instead of Teklo, which is what we've historically used as our starting item in the aggro build, was Teklo. And it was good when people were actively trying to race this, but now as people are trying to full block, Induction Chamber is now a way to grind out the game once you go through the first cycle of your deck. So because of this, we're pretty comfortable going Teklo into Kano. The aggression is going to be really important. We have a pretty dense blue count, and we're able to present a lot of raw damage every turn. So if Kano wants to take damage to either set up for that combo finisher, or to even throw things back at us that are pretty important, right? Something like maybe an Aether Spindle, or perhaps even a Lesson in Lava to tutor up something else, maybe a Sonic Boom. There's going to be some issues, right? And we may even be able to present lethal by the time their Tunic even gets to 3, which is how much raw damage Dash can put out, especially with the Pounder start. So because of those reasons, we're going to go full aggro into Kano. Kano has a really rough time historically into Dash. We're able to go AB3 without losing any of our strong equipment. All we have to do is run Visitronic Model I instead of Crown of Providence. And just like that, we have a super easy matchup into him, traditionally, right? Now, good Kano pilots and with a little bit of luck can probably still beat you. But I think if you play that matchup about 100 times, you're probably going to come out on a much more favored end. I'm not exactly sure if it's free, but it's definitely somewhere between free and favored. So we'll leave it in favored for now. The only downside that's also hurting Kano is just the power level of the deck in CC, but Aether Wildfire does help it out a lot. And next up, we have the Mirror. So the Mirror is about as close as you could ask for a 50-50 even style matchup. I think between the two versions of the deck, you're going to want to be maybe on the pistol version of the deck. Maybe you're not exactly going to want boost all the time. But there's probably some times where you're going to want to actually use that keyword, so maybe you would opt to not use the defense reactions. If the other Dash is on the full aggro strategy and you want to try to fatigue them, you'll probably be okay just full blocking with the amount of 3 blocks in Dash as well as your armor pieces. I think you might actually have an okay time just trying to full block to see if you can fatigue them well. I don't think you necessarily need the defense reactions to do that. So I think that you can go and mix with some pistol items and get ready to play more of a tempo game. but it is kind of difficult, and it's very pilot dependent. It depends on the kind of the style of the deck that you like, because it's such a close and tight matchup. Whatever makes you feel more comfortable in the matchup, whenever you're better at playing, I think it's going to get you over the finish line. The only concern is that if you go full boost into the other dash, the density of 3 blocks can be a problem. But there are some non-blocks in the deck as well. You have things like, the items, especially on like my version, for instance, there's 4 non-blocks in the deck, and that can be a pretty big issue. So you might be able to get over the line. It's just going to be a tight matchup. But obviously, probably the closest definition to even you're probably going to get. After that, we have Azalea. And Azalea is rough, right? So there's 2 ways you could play into Azalea. The first, of course, is going to be the aggressive version. And the thing we have to ask is, well, doesn't Azalea counter aggressive strategies, right? If you plays cards like Hamstring Shot, that's essentially like a Frostbite effect. There's Seek and Destroy that denies you an arsenal. There's even cards like Fatigue Shot. They're going to basically nerf the amount of damage that your attack does. You have Rend the Ledger that prevents you from even going wide, and this is not something you can get around with Achilles or even with High Octane. It's just very difficult to get through. It's like worse than Spinal Crush, basically. You also have Remorseless, which is also really powerful. Sleep Dart doesn't affect S's dash, fortunately. But the question is, would we have trouble as an aggro deck into this? And the answer is kind of, but there is some leeway, right? So the problem is Azalea is just not very good, right? I think if Azalea was stronger, we're going to hit that with Lexi. I think she would be able to deny our aggro strategy a lot stronger, but I don't think she's consistent enough. There's only a couple arrows like Rend the Ledger and maybe Fatigue Shot and kind of Hamstring Shot, but the amount of blues that also doesn't really matter. So there's only a couple disruptive arrows, and they actually don't really do enough to even like fully weaken our turns outside of Rend the Ledger, but there's only 3 of those. So because of that, we can probably be on the race against her, especially because a lot of her things only block for 2, like a very high amount, honestly. And that's going to be really bad. And sometimes they don't even block for anything at all. And so just because of that, I don't think she's going to be able to reliably fatigue, especially only having 4 block on her armor between Tunic, Grapplers, and Skullbone. There's just no way for her to actually like survive, even if she tried full blocking every single turn. And she does have the ability to, because she does have Oasis, and she does have cards like Fate Foreseen, as well as Take Cover. But I think even through those, there's no way she's going to be able to actually stop a lot of your damage. Usually decks that are able to actually fatigue you on aggro, if you know what you're doing, are normally decks that have like a fridge, that have like an insane amount of armor, usually above like 6 armor in terms of total life. And so 4s is not going to cut it for her, on top of having so many 3 blocks, or no, sorry, not having enough 3 blocks, having a lot of 2 blocks, and even having non-blocks. There's just no way. So you can start pounding this matchup and just go really hard. And if she ever tries to block to stop you, she loses so much efficiency, because a lot of these cards are just strictly better on offense, right? This is 3 on offense, but only 2 on defense. And so she doesn't really gain much from going on the defensive. She wants to be offensive and try to disrupt you to keep on that pressure. But it's a problem when her arrows are just simply not as disruptive as Lexi's. So because of that, we're going to throw her pretty close to free. But once again, that mostly has to do with the power level of her deck. Next up, we have Viserai. So Viserai is tough. Viserai in Uprising is a little bit different than what it was in Everfest, mainly because of the Skeletta ban. That's pretty big, right? So Skeletta Vis was very different. You did not win into that. That's probably almost close to a concede to rough as you can get. But the new Vis is a little bit weaker, of course, not having Skeletta. That's a pretty big difference. But they're still very good and still packs a lot of damage, a lot of consistency. Mostly looking to play a Mob Skies every turn, give a Rune Blade attack go again, maybe like Shrill a Skull Form or a Spellblade Assault, any of these. And then followed up sometimes to the finisher like Revel and Runeblood, but normally closing it out by swinging the Rosetta Thorn for a split of 2 and 2 every turn, 2 physical and 2 arcane. Very powerful, very potent. Everything's above rate because of Viserai's ability to give a Rune Chant after you have played a non-attack action. Anytime you play a Runeblade card after that, it's going to give you an extra Rune Chant. So the problem is every single Viserai card is just above rate. It's like potentially like one of the strongest like hero abilities in my opinion, besides like Briar Priorata. So like Revel and Runeblood in any other Runeblade is 0 for 4. But in Viserai, he gets an extra Rune Chant because of his passive on his hero text. So Revel and Runeblood is a 0 for 5 arcane, which is like insane. It's insane. Like a 0 for 4 is already good, but a 0 for 5 on evasive damage. It's crazy. So you'll go Revel and Runeblood, make 5 Rune Chants, and then you'll play Rosetta Thorn and swing for 9 at that point. Although normally it's after you play an attack, and the attack itself leaves behind a Rune Chant. So Thorn will come in for 10, and this is 1 resource, right? 1 resource and 1 card gives you 10 damage. 2 of it's physical, and 8 of it is arcane, and also 2 of it is on 1 source. So you can't even block all of it with Arcane Barrier 1, even if you wanted to. It's just tough. It's just not a good time. Mid-range dash had almost no game into Viserai, and the new aggressive build can definitely do it, but it is still a really tight game. Even if Viserai is forced to block with cards or decides to, he's still able to come back with very efficient 2 to 3 card hands. So just because of that, it's not going to be easy for you. Viserai can fatigue you if he wants. The amount of armor that they have available to them between Grasp, Creepers, Crown, and Tunic is very strong, and sometimes they're even running the other chest piece with Battle Worn where you can break it for 2 resources. I forgot the name, but I'm pretty sure it's from Monarch. But Viserai can fatigue you if you just go Pounder and just try like going full aggro into them. So I think because of it, you're going to want to go with the aggro plan just because racing is the only way to get there. You're not going to get there by trying to play this grindy game, but you're going to want to start Induction Chamber instead of Tekla Pounder. So in terms of placement, it's definitely in the rough tier. It's not exactly a concede like it was during the Everfest season. You are able to actually beat it a decent amount of times if you play the matchup enough. In terms of just an overall spread, like an overall win rate, it's not terrible, but you're absolutely not favored. And if you're expecting like this at a local scene and you're bringing Dash with the expectation to win, you should probably keep that in mind. That's all I'll say. So like, you know, if you're thinking about bringing Dash to Nationals and you think it's just going to be like Viserai there for some reason, I mean, that's not even taking into account the other Rune Blade that's obviously better, which is Briar. It's just, yeah, it's going to be a tough time. So after Viserai, we're going to move on to Oldhim. Now, this one's going to be tough, right? So this one's going to take a little bit of explaining, because I, at the time of this recording, have found myself in a lot of conversations about Oldhim and whether or not Dash is still favored into him. So, okay, where do we begin? So let's start with, what is the game plan of Guardians, right? What is the game plan of Oldhim? So the game plan of Oldhim in this list is a little bit different than what it traditionally has been. Traditionally, Guardians have very strong blocking capabilities. If you look at someone like Briar who can attack above rate, normally Oldhim can block above rate. So what that means is that instead of normally presenting damage, they're really good at preventing it. And the way that would kind of work is it's almost like threat removal. Think of like the fact that you could throw Snatch at your opponent, and if the Guardian can block it almost seamlessly, what that means is you now have 1 less Snatch in your deck, right? So once you play all 3, the power level of your deck has sort of weakened a little bit. Once you go through all your red attacks and you hit the late game, if you haven't killed your opponent, your deck does become weaker, and that's a concept called fatigue, right? Normally when people talk about fatigue, they think about you running out of cards and no longer having a deck, but that element of decking yourself is only a symptom of what fatigue is, right? So let's say we're on Dash, right? And we're like just going full aggro. What's going to require is that we're going to have to pitch blues, play all of our red cards, right? We're going to need blues to play our crazy throttle, high speed impact, T-bone, maximum velocity turn. I don't know if those resources line up, but you get the idea, right? So we use our blues to play our reds. That's just that's kind of the way the game is meant to be played. And what happens is that we hope to kill our opponent with our reds, right? We hope that when we're dealing 15 to 20 damage, our opponent is not able to block at all, and that eventually they keep on leaking damage and they die. But what happens is that if the game goes long enough, right, because we cycle through the deck, because the pitch cards, you know, we know how Flesh and Blood works. So the problem is that if your opponent doesn't die by the time you get to that place in your deck where you start redrawing all the cards you're pitching, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to draw all blue hands. You're going to draw a hand that's like blue zipper hit, blue throttle, blue 0 to 60, and a blue T-bone, right? And now that hand, if you want to play it as optimally as possible, does 3, 7, 9? Does 9 damage, right? On a 4-card hand. That's really bad, right? And that's just an example of Dash. So Guardian is able to slowly grind out the game, normally with their weapons, with their blocking capabilities. And once they get you to that point, you're no longer able to push damage, and if they're still attacking back into you, you're taking damage as well, and you have to start blocking with cards, and you're not closing the game out, and then eventually run out of cards, right? So decking is a symptom of fatigue, but fatigue itself is more of a conceptual idea of actually tiring out your opponent's deck, right? Their offenses, the strength of their deck, your opponent gets tired, right? They used all their gas in the early game, and now they're just out of juice. That's just how it works. So that's the end game of Oldhim, right? So why has Dash always been good into Guardians, right? Not necessarily just Oldhim, but why has Dash been good into Bravo as well? Well, there's a few reasons, but a pretty big reason is that Dash actually ideally would want to get to the end game, right? If we're on the pistol build, she wants to hit that end game where all of her pistol items are out, and she's drawing 4 blues a turn to use them, which ironically is where the Guardian player would normally be their strongest because your opponent's deck is weak, but the Guardian's weapon is still just as powerful. Normally they're pressuring you through their weapon or through attacks that they pitch stacked. That's when Dash becomes her strongest. So then the question is, can Guardian kill Dash in the early game? And the answer is normally no, right? Most Guardian hands are not able to present the same kinds of damage that other aggro decks are able to. Of course, that would make sense, right? That's the trade-off, is that they have very strong blues, they have very strong weapons that work well with the blues, they have very good blocking capabilities, but they don't really have ways to go wide, and they don't really have ways to stack damage the same way that other aggro decks do, right? To some degree. Of course, that would just be the trade-off of the class. So traditionally, Dash has been pretty good into Guardian. Now, some things are changing, right? So, for instance, if we go and look at this Oldhim list, we see a couple things. We see E-Strike. That's a way to give go again, to go a little bit wider than normal. So Guardian's now able to go a little bit wider if they're able to tech in certain generics or cards within the card pool. We also see, notably, Red Macho Grande, new card from Everfest. And this is a 10 with Dominate, just on its own, doesn't need anything else, but it just costs 7, right? So they need to keep normally about 2 cards in Tunic or 3 cards to play it. So that is pretty difficult. But we also see some things in here. We see Red Pummel, we see Blue Pummel, we see Blue and Red Glacial Footsteps, right? Another 10 with Dominate. So the difference is now the Oldhim lists are starting to be a little bit more aggressive. They're starting to try to push a little bit more damage. And that is a problem for Dash, right? Because now Oldhim is realizing that in the certain matchups, maybe like Dromai, Iyslander, and Dash, they no longer win the endgame because there are now decks that actually have stronger endgames than Guardian. They're a little bit more of setup decks or mid-range decks that have these very powerful permanents that can stay on the board. Iyslander has Frost Tax, Dromai has her entire board state, and then Dash has the pistol items, so the Guardian's now trying to find ways in those matchups to try to close them a little bit earlier and to pressure your opponent. So because of that, Dash does actually notably feel a little bit worse into Oldhim specifically. So the question is whether or not she's even still favored anymore. And I think the question is mostly answered by what your sideboard looks like, because surprisingly enough, I've now seen some hybrid versions of Dash that don't even have defense reactions in their sideboard, or they only have 6 sometimes, or they only have 3. And that's really that's a little bit strange to me, because I think that the point of this sideboard plan basically is that you have a 13, 12 card plan that still beats Guardians, right? That was the initial plan for this deck, was the hybrid build was sort of a solution to needing aggro into a lot of matchups, because when you looked at the meta, when this deck was starting to be brewed, there was an issue where Dash aggro was actually kind of decent into things like Rune Blades, into some of the into a good spread of the meta, right? We're going to see that as the list goes on. But the problem is that if you have a full boost aggro Dash, there's no way she ever beats Guardians, right? And if Guardians are going to be a part of the meta, how do you combat that? You just say, oh, I'm going to have like a little bit worse of a time into, I don't know, Guardians, but it's bad, right? And there's pretty much no way you're going to be able to get over their defenses. So the inclusion of this sideboard plan was a way to actually very elegantly have an aggro Dash deck that still was able to rely on the strength of the pistol version to also have very good Guardian matchups and other slower matchups as well. So because of that, your sideboard guide needs to pretty much be all in on beating Guardian, right? So I think that this is a sideboard plan I'm very comfortable with. And in my testing, I've felt fine, right? At least like compared to what I've heard from other people. Even into the more aggressive Guardians now. The only thing is I think your priorities need to change. So before, of course, Red Immovable is a very simple way to stop Oakenold, right? Because you were just unmovable in a piece of armor and you stop an Oakenold, and that was like how older Dash would just like completely like dunk on Oldhim even in the end game. The problem now is that maybe they might actually play Oakenold, but there's a good chance that sometimes they'll even just block with it, attack with it just for 7, and they're mostly relying on a lot of these effects to actually deal damage to you. And the difference is that my priorities have changed now, where I just use Ren Immovable like almost at the first chance I get. If there's anything with Dominate that comes in for 8 or higher, I just shoot the Ren Immovable then. Because now this matchup is based a lot around life total and life parity, and less about stacking up this crazy endgame, because Oldhim's going nuts. I'm seeing Oldhim's not Arsenal, I'm seeing Oldhim's not Crown, sometimes not even Rampart enemy. And it's just because they need to keep everything, right? They need to keep their super powerful hand that can present, you know, like 10 with Dominate, that can do CNC Pummel, that can do basically anything with Pummel, right? These very strong hands that are trying to disrupt you and kill you before you're able to assemble the pistol engine. So because of that, your life is a really big resource now in that matchup, and you just need to be aggressive with D-reacts. If they're going to be aggressive with damage, you need to be aggressive with defenses. Now, I'm still very careful about when to use armor, but in terms of D-reacts, I'm normally much more liberal in how early I'm willing to let go of them, mostly because they are going to be keeping these super powerful hands, normally using Glacial or Macho Grande. Sometimes there's going to be a fused Oakenold, also pummels on some things. CNC Pummel, of course, is a problem as well. And because they're going to run so many pummels in CNC, well, of course, they're on the traditional 3 CNCs, but now they're going to be opting to run a lot of pummels, a lot more than normal. You can't really keep your D-reacts in your arsenal for too long, or else they become a liability, because if they CNC pummel you, you can't D-react out of arsenal, and so at that point, you just lose the arsenal, and that sucks. So I've learned to let go of my D-reacts a lot earlier, to preserve my life total as much as I can. If they throw anything at me that does not have Dominate, I take that immediately as an opportunity to block. Even if I have like blues in hand and I could return with the pistols, the biggest difference is that you're going to be given opportunities to keep cards, right? Because of Dominate, right? So if your idea is that like, oh yeah, they threw 7 at me, but I'm only going to block 3 because I really want to keep these cards to throw damage back at Oldhim, trust me, when they throw Red Macho Grande, you're only going to get 1 card to block with, right? So you'll get to keep your 3 cards and you'll get to return fire, right? So whenever they give you an opportunity to block without Dominate, take it, cover all of it sometimes. Like sometimes now it's even correct to block 2 cards on Winter's Wail, even if it doesn't have a Frostbite attached to it, right? If your hand doesn't actually need that last card to do anything, if we're talking like first cycle, and you don't want to boost, obviously, because you don't either want to hit a D-react or a pistol item, and you're not really sure what to do with that last card, just block with it. Take the 1 life, right? That 1 life, even if over a couple, periods, is going to be super important when they're trying to set up this end game, or even this early to mid game on you, where they're just throwing Dominates, right? So that life total really matters. So every time they don't present you with something with Dominate, just take it, block. Unless, like, of course, if your hand, has like a pistol item or something, or you need a spark to get your pistol item, then maybe it's okay. But even then, it's a little bit shaky, right? Even then, maybe sometimes it is correct to actually block with the Spark of Genius. Take that 3 block on it and just keep going, right? Because you're going to be able to grind on the end game the same way. So yeah, you're going to swap in your pistol package. You're going to remove a couple cards, right? Obviously, you're going to remove Combustible Courier. No reason to keep that card here. No reason to keep Maximum Velocity either. So you can cut these. You can cut Tekla Pounder. You can arguably even cut a core if you want. Having non-blocks in this matchup is now dangerous, even though it does sort of encroach on your non-block ratio, which is kind of a danger to be in. So at this point, let's only cut 1 Tekla Pounder. So with the starting item, we need to find room for 12 cards, although we can even cut down 2 more. So normally you can cut Pounder, you can cut the Maximum Velocities and Combustible Couriers. You should maybe leave in 1 High Octane. It is kind of nice to close out the end game sometimes. It doesn't always work because of Rampart, but sometimes you just need that last extra card draw and a way to maybe get 1 to 2 extra action points. That's pretty much all you need. And after that, you can start to cut some of the red cards as well. So for instance, red Zipper Hit can normally go, although sometimes it's good. I actually kind of like red Zipper Hit. I think maybe you can cut red Throttle. And of course, red T-Bone. Red T-Bone can leave the deck immediately. So actually, you're probably fine just cutting red T-Bones, red Combustibles, the Maximum Velocity, and a Tekla Pounder. At that point, you've cut 10 cards, and you can probably cut your Throttles. And after that, you should have enough. So that number might be a little bit off, but you get the idea. The reason why Zipper Hit's a little bit more important is that late game it comes in on a break point, and more importantly, early game you can keep a blue and a red Zipper Hit, and you can go pistol, induction chamber, and then after committing to Rampart and Crown, you can then choose not to reload the pistol, keep the chain open, and you just play Zipper Hit right off of blue, which is probably like a little bit better than Throttle. The 5 damage is just good enough. Throttle's probably not going to make too big of a difference. So that's how I would approach that matchup. The other thing to keep in mind is the amount of pistol items. This seems kind of, I've also realized there's a lot of controversy kind of about this. I think literally in the general Discord, there's like a debate going on right now about it. Last time I tapped in, but in my opinion, I think 2 and 2 is enough. 2 induction chambers, 2 plasma purifiers. I was talking to Tarek Patel, and he was arguing that you should go 1 induction chamber and 3 purifiers, and that's kind of interesting. I'll throw that idea out there, although I will say I have not tested it, so I can't vouch for it one way or the other. The theory is kind of okay there. The only problem is that it's going to be difficult to go wide enough on the chain late game when the Oldhim's super low to actually strip enough cards that you're able to win at that point. So I don't really know how you win with that setup, but regardless. So 2 purifiers and 2 induction chambers comes in for 4 3 times. And the reason why that's relevant is because Crown and Rampart will block for 2. And then when you reload the pistol, Rampart will go up by 1, so it'll block for 2. And then it'll block for 3. So with 2 and 2, shooting 3 times, what that means is that every time comes in for 4, right? So that means that you're going to leak 2 damage on the first Crown and Shield block. You're going to leak 2 damage on the second shield block for 2. And you're going to leak 1 damage on the third shield block for 3. So what that means is that you're leaking 5 damage a turn, right? That's good. But what's more important is that means that if the Oldhim ever goes to 1, they're going to be forced to also block with cards from hand on every single pistol shot, right? If they're only going to be relying on Rampart to do the job and Crown, there's an issue now where late game, if they're at 1, every single shot is lethal, even through Rampart and Crown, even all 3, right? Even that last one leaks a point of damage over. So they're going to be forced to commit an entire card, right? If they just want to Earth React, that won't work because it would get eaten up on one of the first 2 pistol shots. So even Earth React can't carry over the same way. So because of that, in my opinion, 2-2 is just enough, right? The third purifier normally requires you to take extra damage to set it up, right? Your opponent's going to come in with an attack. You could block with 3 cards, you could block with 4 cards, but because you have a card you need to pitch to play the third purifier, or you want to spark a genius to that last purifier, so you need to keep 3 cards. What I've witnessed is that a lot of people take a bunch of unnecessary damage to set up that third purifier. And because purifier only gets value later as the game goes on, its value in the short term is negative, right? You took 6 damage to play an item that doesn't do anything, so you're -6, right? The idea is that you would activate it, shoot 3 times, and so you get 3 value that way. So it would take 2 turns just to break even, just to go to 0 value, right? You've done 6 damage, but you took 6 damage, you're neutral, right? You're back at 0. And then it would require anything after that to start to gain value, right? So it seems good in theory, right? But the problem is that taking 6 damage in this matchup is huge. It's not just about like you going back and forth with Oldhim, right? If we were on the older versions of Oldhim, sure, you could argue that's probably good, right? But when they're doing this shit, like, no way, right? It's just not gonna happen. It's not gonna happen. Like, the 6 damage you take from it is gonna be so consequential. Like, I don't know. Every time I've seen someone take damage to set that third purifier, it's never felt worth it to me. Normally they lose the game and the Oldhim isn't dead anyway, so the purifier didn't really pressure anything. You know, if they're above 1 life and they didn't have to block with someone in the last turn, if you never presented lethal to them, then like, did the purifier really do anything? So I don't know. I just don't like it. I don't like the argument either that you increase it to increase your chances of drawing it. It's a 1 in 59 chance. Like, you're fine already with the current setup of things. If you're blocking efficiently and smartly, blocking every time they present something that doesn't have dominate, your life total is big enough that you're going to be able to eventually grind through your deck and find them, right? So I don't know. That's just me. I don't like the third purifier. If you want to try 3 purifiers and 1 induction chamber, you know, that's different. So I think what I'm trying to say is that not knowing if three purifiers and 1 chamber is correct, what I am saying is that I only like 4 items. 4 items normally feels like the perfect amount where you're able to win the late game against Oldhim. You're able to pressure them. It's very good value. You don't take too much damage to set them up. That's normally the biggest issue. So that concludes Oldhim, right? All right, that's probably the hardest one out here. So what is it, right? I think if you're on the older versions of Dash, right, the more mid-range builds, I could play Tome, I could play extra defense reactions if you wanted, they could play Reinforce the line if they needed to. They didn't have as much reliance on non-block items to satisfy their blue count, and they naturally had higher blue counts. And Oldhim was not on these crazy Red Macho Grande, Red Glacial Footsteps list. It would be close to free. It would be close to free, highly favored. There's almost no way that Oldhim could pressure you, and your endgame was just too strong, and you were able to control the game. It never felt like you were really in danger much, right? But with the newer builds and the hybrid list being naturally weaker to Guardian, that is a problem, right? That is a problem with the hybrid builds. That was my first concern when I started seeing them, especially seeing lists now that are even like running less than 9 defense reactions. The deck is neutering its power to beat Guardian, right? Even with this, right? Even if we side in stuff, we're still running like Teklovossen and maybe arguably Pounder, right? Our blue ratio is pretty tight. So just naturally because of that, like our Guardian matchup's a little bit weaker. Not having Tome is another big thing as well. It's a tough time. So I don't know what to tell you. I think now it's pretty close to even though. So we'll leave it there. And now we can move on to Lexi. So Lexi is sort of like Ranger. Well, of course it's like Ranger. It is a Ranger. I don't know what I'm saying. So Lexi is kind of weird, right? I think both versions of the deck have very noticeable flaws in Lexi. I think Lexi is pretty difficult. So let's say we're on the aggro package, right? Let's say we're gonna go Pounder because just like Azalea, she has a very hard time getting meaningful blocks out of her equipment. Especially also having, once again, 2 blocks and even non-blocks in the deck. So let's say we want to go full aggro. We're not concerned about fatigue. And more importantly, we can start Pounder so we can go 100% in on aggro. There are some issues, right? We do have a decent blue count. We don't really have any disruptive on hits outside of Combustible Courier just being a very strong card that swings a lot of tempo just because of damage. It's essentially a 2 for a 7. But the problem is if Lexi even has 1 solid turn to lock us down, usually with Chilling Ice Vein, Blizzard Bolt, Channel Lake, flipping over a card, even a Race Face now, which is crazy. You have Frostlock. It's difficult, right? Even cards like Icequake. And especially because these can hit multiple times in 1 turn, of course, like Chilling Ice Vein can get 2 triggers in 1 turn, same with Blizzard Bolt. You're just going to get stripped of cards, right? And the question is, can they carry over to the next turn, right? Because it's easy to disrupt people as Ranger for 1 turn, right? If you're Azalea, it's very easy to disrupt them if you get a dominated red in the ledger for like 10 or something like that into an aggro deck, right? But the question is, what are you going to draw into the next hand? And is that going to be enough to keep up that pressure, right? You stall your opponent for 1 turn, but can you keep it up? And the thing with Lexi is she actually can. She's very consistent. She's very explosive as well. She has incredibly high damage ceilings with Art of War turns and 3 of a kind. His 2 cards are very incredibly powerful, and Lexi's able to abuse them pretty well in her deck. Especially cards like Rain Razors. There's just so much damage that she can actually output. It's like kind of insane. Especially if she's able to break Bullseye Bracers and just keep on going on these like 3 of a kind Art of War turns. They're nuts, right? And Channel Lake Frigid completely locks you out of a deck. So because of that, there is an issue where both sides of the deck struggle, right? The other thing is that, so let's say instead we want to try to full block and go pistols, right? Our defense reactions are meaningless, right? If she has so many ice cards, and if she flips up an ice card, you're going to get a Frostbite, and now your Fate for Seeing costs 1. So that now requires 2 cards to block 4 damage, and it's just not worth it, right? And you can wait till she doesn't flip over an ice card, and maybe that's okay. But what happens, like if you get stuck with multiple defense reactions? Like, yeah, you can pitch them to play the other defense reaction if you're drawing like 3 in a hand, but it sucks, right? It's just a pretty big problem there. And even through Channel Lake Frigid turns, it's going to be like near impossible. So like that's also an issue. So where I'm kind of landing on this matchup, and this needs more testing, is I think you're going to go aggro, and you're going to hope that your pressure is good enough and that the Lexi can still brick on turn. She can still draw like 4 arrows in a turn, have no way to fuse them, or she can draw all non-arrows and have no way to attack or pressure you. So there are ways that Lexi can trip up. and she blocks very poorly, and once she starts blocking, she's in a very bad spot. She can't play mid-range effectively at all. She usually needs at least 2 cards to even have a turn, 3 cards to normally present any kind of disruption. So she can't really block, and if she blocks, she basically is just like not even playing the game at that point. So you can't go aggro. There is an untested idea out there though, that you could you could go Pistol Items, but there's also a version where you can just try to get all blocking value cards in there. I mean, you can put in your unmovables, right? Because the immovables actually work pretty well on these Go Tall arrows, especially when they're stacking them right. And if you're gonna lose a card anyway to one of these effects, like Chilling Ice Vein, then maybe you're fine like pitching into a D-React, right? So there is an idea out there that you can like full fatigue Lexi, of course, much like Azalea. They do have a way to just straight up run out of attacks. Their weapons don't attack on their own. There's simply ways to load the arrows to play them. So they actually do have a finite amount of attacks in the deck. So there is an idea floating out there that you could actually fatigue them. And I actually need to try this myself. So I will try it and I'll report back in some capacity. But until then, she's going in the rough tier. She always just felt like she has some kind of disruption and counteracting strategy to what you want to do, regardless of the version of dash you're on. Of course, it's making it very difficult to play your defense reactions. It's, of course, not the same way into Oldhim as with Oldhim. You're going to be pitching a Crown and Rampart. You're going to have defense available to you. And you're also going to have resources to play defense reactions if you need to, just through the nature of you pitching cards anyway. But Dash doesn't have that, so removing a card simply to play a defense reaction just simply weakens the deck. So it's a tough time regardless of what you're doing. So after that we have Briar. And Briar is probably the best deck in the format at the moment. That's my personal opinion. She doesn't really seem to have any auto loss matchups at all. Even the Guardians that are seemingly meant to counter her can get blown out by incredibly powerful Channel Mount Heroic turns, of course. It's just so strong of a card. This is like the linchpin of the deck, sort of, but she's also incredibly powerful even without Channel Mount Heroic. Even if she doesn't draw CMH, she can still play fine. She's still an incredibly strong Runeblade. She's eaten multiple bans at this point. She's eaten an errata, the only like errata in that capacity in Flesh and Blood. And she's still tier 1, right? So at this point, and like she's almost completely living legend out in under a year. So, you know, that just goes to show like how strong she is. Like the hero text as well is incredibly powerful. Giving the earth and lightning embodiments is just fantastic. Even when they errated it, so she can only make 1 earth embodiment, still super good. Not much else to say. We're looking at the Pro Tour Lil list, and look at that. Look at that. Doesn't that just haunt you? Does that just haunt you? Look at that thing. There's one in the deck, but now you have to fear it, right? There's a smashing good time out there. And so it's crazy, right? They also have incredibly good blocking capabilities between, once again, the same Runeblade Fridge. Thank God they don't have Skeletta anymore. But you have Grasp, Tunic, or either Ironweave, Spellbound Creepers, and Crown of Providence. You're also going to see a lot of 3 blocks in the deck that can even be turned into 4 blocks because of her ability. Any 2 blocks in the list are deceptive because if she hits you, she's going to get an Earth Embodiment and they're going to get +1 while defending. So they actually block for 3. So that actually makes playing counter into her pretty difficult. We actually saw in the top 8 of Lil a Dash Briar matchup where the Dash lost because of just pure fatigue. All the Briar would do is basically throw 1 attack every turn, a 0 cost attack that would threaten a Earth Embodiment trigger. So we can think of cards like Snatch, maybe Overload, Arcana Crackle, right? These are all really good. And then we get an Earth Embodiment and then just like full block with every single non-attack in the deck, right? Like Channel Mount Heroics, Force of Nature is now blocked for 4. All these cards now blocked for 3, right? So it's difficult. It's difficult. And then you have to get through the fridge as well. So it's kind of tough. I think Induction Chamber is the way to go now. And I think you're just got to hope that you're able to race them still. The problem is that if you go Induction Chamber now, they can just race you and your deck is a little bit weaker because you're going to miss out from the +6 damage in total from the Tekla Pounder starting on the field. But what it does mean is that late game, when you hit your blue stack and the Briar is super low, you're able to grind out the game with Induction Chambers and you're able to go wide enough that eventually you'll beat them even if they're full blocking. But of course, incredibly powerful deck, ways to stack non-attacks and attacks together, buffing them, ending with Rosetta Thorn. Rosetta Thorn is probably just one of the strongest weapons in Flesh and Blood. I personally am sort of looking forward to it going, right? It's incredibly powerful. There are other really strong weapons out there, of course, But Rosetta Thorn is very difficult for mid-range strategies because of the split damage of it. You can only really choose to deal with one end, right? Either you choose to deal with the arcane damage or you normally choose to deal with the physical. It's normally very difficult to choose to do both unless if you're a full blocking control deck. So because of that, it has kind of invalidated a lot of mid-range strategies, and I think it will open up some good space once it heads out. But until then, how do you beat it? Great question. If we knew, she wouldn't be good anymore, right? No, I'm kidding. Disruptive Guardians are very good into her. So is Iyslander, ways to tax her. She can still win, of course, through just high roll and channel mount heroic, drawing them early. It's very difficult for Oldhim to really do too much when he's getting hit for 20 damage every turn with the channel mount heroics, right? You can only block so much, even through ice react and things like that. It's pretty difficult. But racing is probably your best way to go. You will potentially run into some issues as she does have very relevant on hits that require you sometimes to block down to 2 cards, usually, sometimes 1. But the blocking capability of Dash is actually going to be a pretty big benefit for you, basically, because at least you can block well, right? Like if there's an off turn and she throws Snatch at you for 7 or something, you at least can block for 9 pretty comfortably, or you can block for 6 and throw a piece of armor in front, and you're doing pretty okay, right? And you're able to play off 2 card hands pretty effectively, especially if you're even running Induction Chamber as well. I've noticed even in aggro racing against Briar, where I'm playing aggro, there will still be turns where Briar just simply presents so strong of a threat, and I just look at my hand, and I'm like, there's a line where I can just block with 3 cards for 9 on this, I can keep a blue, and I can go pistol, Induction Chamber, pistol, and that 1 card hand still does 4, right? Which is pretty much on par with what she's doing, right? Where she can keep a 1 card hand and throw a 4-bag at you, but she has less ways to do it, right? I mean, Overload's only 3, Arcana Crackle is 4, and it's even worse because it's split damage. But regardless, he doesn't have as many 1 card hands that deal 4, but you actually do, right? So sometimes there's just an option when you're racing her to have an off turn cycle where your hand's a little bit weaker, but it still blocks for 9, or you can still pitch something because of your blues to Arcane Barrier, and you just come back with a pistol and Induction Chamber. So there are ways that you can do absolutely fine in the matchup. It's just going to take a lot of reps, a lot of skill, and you're probably going to not expect to win a whole lot. It's not necessarily concede, but it's pretty close. It's pretty close. After that, we have Iyslander. Iyslander is a tricky one. We're still trying to figure out exactly what her finalized lists look like. They're kind of all over the place, and they're still getting theory crafted. They're still getting practice. They're still getting tested. So I think as time goes on, towards the end of the Nat season, maybe in the Worlds, we'll start to see really what the Iyslander lists look like. But of course, we're prioritizing blue cards and Arsenal to play on our opponent's turn, giving them Frostbites, using Waning Moon to leak damage every single turn through arcane damage. And then depending on what their end game is, we can set up things with Insidious Chill and Frost Hex, lock them out of the game, and then deal a bunch of damage, usually with cards like Ice Eternal, normally blowing them out once you have every single Frost Hex on the table. Additionally, she also has a lot of utility, a lot of disruptive blues as well. Cards like Hypothermia, Like Frigid, Winter's Bite. These are all cards that can be played out of Arsenal. Blizzard actually gives you a Frostbite on top of the added effect because it's an ice card being played during your turn. She has very aggressive proactive cards as well, like Aether Ice Strain, coming in on Arcane Barrier breakpoints and forcing you to lose a card or pay 2. So it's tough, right? It's kind of mid-rangey. Normally looking to play with about 2 cards a turn, keeping 2 cards. We're normally keeping 1 card, but of course playing it on your opponent's turn from Arsenal. So she needs to keep herself on that cycle of always keeping 1 card a turn to Arsenal, normally a blue that's disruptive in some capacity. So because of that, it's a hard deck to pin down. It's hard to tell really if you're favored or not. Once again, just like Kano, you have a good blue density, you have easy access to Arcane Barrier 3, you present a lot of raw damage, and so because of that, normally you do have a little bit of an easier time into Iyslander compared to other decks, but there is an issue though where 38 life is still kind of a lot, or 36 if I'm recalling correctly. 36 is a lot. It's closer to, Kano, but it is hard to get through that last 6 points of life, right? Especially when she's able to run Ironhide Gauntlet and Coronet Peak. She has a little bit more blocking capabilities compared to Kano, especially having access to D-Reacts, having access to a lot more 3 blocks typically, although the ice cards do block for 2. So that is pretty good, but the disruption also allows her to live through a lot of pretty impactful turns. For instance, she can just shut down high octane turns by playing hypothermia. Now that is a problem, right? That's a problem. It also can completely brick some of your aggro turns where you want to pivot into them and then they shut you down immediately by playing hypothermia. High octane sort of gets around it, but the problem is you're just only going to be netting your action point back every turn. So be able to play your turn like normal, but it'll deny you the ability to pistol out for a bunch. So hypothermia will sometimes save them about 8 life normally. If you're typically getting about 4 pistol shots in on your high octane turns, the problem is that hypothermia is going to deny any of those 4 extra action points from happening. So that's a problem. And you combine that with like Winter's Bite or instant speed channel like Frigid, and you're gonna have a hard time. But what I will tell you is that the pistol version has a worse time, because as the game goes on, you're gonna stack all of those frost hexes. Being able to pay for all of your induction chambers and your purifiers and your pistol shots is gonna be near impossible between all the frostbite she's gonna give you in the late game. Added with the disruption, right, of like instant speed channel like Frigid, so you're not gonna be able to actively be able to do anything. So because of that, you just have to race hard in that sense. You just have to prevent strong damage. Try to keep her from being able to arsenal her 1 card. Or if you do, make her take a lot of damage to do it, basically. So you're going to want to go aggro. Pretty much the only way to handle the matchup. But I don't think you're going to start Teklovossen. It's just too easy for them to fatigue you if they really want to. They have a lot more defensive capabilities compared to other decks. Added with the ability to also disrupt your high impact turns, right? So if you go all in on a Teklovossen turn and they, blizzard you, or if they, for instance, channel like you, hypothermia you, there is a problem, of course, where they significantly weaken the impact of your turn, which makes it harder for you to push damage, which means that you're now burning Teklovossen for not really great value, and you're going to have a harder time closing out the game. Now, do keep in mind Achilles Accelerator can be a great way to blow out the Iyslander player. So if they commit late game to a hypothermia or a blizzard, and you, for instance, don't want to pay for the blizzard because you need the 2 resources to keep going on your turn, you can just elect not to pay for the blizzard and then break your Achilles Accelerators and keep going, right? So that's really good, but you shouldn't do it too early in the game because then you're down an Arcane Barrier. So this is more for late game when you're really trying to close out the game and they're really trying to disrupt you to the best of their ability to keep you from doing so. And until then, I think I would be comfortable probably putting it in the even category. It's very much going to be player skill determined. It's not going to be easy, but it can very much easily swing in either direction. Prism is no longer in the game, so we don't have to worry about her. But moving on from Iyslander, we have Boltyn. So Boltyn's a hard one, right? Right now we're looking at the Lumina combo version, which is going to be charging enough cards in the soul and then playing Lumina Ascension, normally in pairs, sometimes in triplets. That's the high roll of the deck if they can really get there. But being able to attack with the sabers a bunch of times, so Lumina Ascension will buff the sabers and then allow them to attack an additional time. So for instance, if they play 2 Luminas, the sabers will get buffed up to 4, and then they'll be able to attack 3 times in 1 turn. That's really strong, especially considering if you block with an attack action card, which, surprise, Dash has a lot of. They're going to get +1 for the other 2 additional attacks. So assuming you block with an attack action card on the first saber swing, the next 2 are going to come in with +1. Let's say you block the second saber swing with another attack action card. It's going to stack another point of damage. Normally this is comboed out with Gallantry Gold, so another +1 to all attacks, and then Courage of Blade holds that every single saber swing is going to cost 0. So that's pretty much the combo line of the deck. The way that it has to get there is it has to charge enough cards in Soul, because the cards in Soul are what give Boltyn go again, removing them because the sabers are buffed. So early game, he's going to have to charge his Soul a lot. Normally that's going to require at least 2 to 3 cards a turn. Some of these charge cards are 0, but sometimes they do actually cost something, which is going to be difficult, right? So normally Boltyn has to keep 2 card hands, sometimes 3 card hands to be able to do anything, coming back to the opponent. And so because of that, you're able to raise him incredibly quickly, but you do have to keep in mind, since he's a warrior, they do have a ton of 3 blocks, but the armor is tough, right? There's only 3 block on the armor in total, so I think you can go pounder here and probably be okay. You're just going to be a little bit more careful. If it seems like you need to go induction chamber in this matchup, then of course we can readjust and go induction chamber. But racing this deck is going to be pretty good because if they actually want to commit to setting up the Lumina combo, they're going to need to keep 2 to 3 cards a turn, which means that you're going to be leaking a lot of damage, especially early game. So you're normally doing okay, and especially if they actually do think they want to commit to the Saber lines, they can't block with any cards like Lumina, and so because of that, it's gonna be difficult for Boltyn. Before, on the mid-range version of Dash, this was like your worst matchup because Boltyn can do pretty well into slower decks or more mid-rangey decks because you don't really have a way to stop him from accumulating the cards in Soul, and once he goes to the limited turn, you don't have a way to shut it down right. It's a lot better if you're playing Iyslander and you're able to Hypothermia or Blizzard him, but it's much different if you're Dash, right? So the aggro version has been the way to go for it. Simply trying to raise him, you're able to pressure him normally a lot harder. Because of that, I would probably just put him maybe in favor to even. I think I'd put him slightly towards favored just because, once again, it's not that the strategy of your deck is countering his. It's kind of like Azalea, right? For instance, we're seeing Azalea here and we're seeing Lexi down here. They're almost functionally the same deck. The only difference is that Azalea's card pool is a little bit weaker and her consistency is weaker than Lexi, right? So it's the same thing with Boltyn. It's not that you in theory have a good Boltyn matchup. I think Boltyn actually would probably beat you if the cards in Boltyn were better. But because the cards in Boltyn are a little bit underpowered, he's more of a, off meta. He's a people's champion, right? People love Boltyn. There are Boltyn mains, right? Shout out to you. Shout out to you, dude. Look at that. RTN first. That's awesome, right? This is Boltyn. He's in a tough spot. He's not a good hero. No Boltyn main, is gonna lie about that. That's why they like him, right? Or maybe they like the mechanics, maybe they like the Lumina combo, but he's like the underdog of Fab, right? It's the same thing with Azalea. Whenever you see Azalea on stream, like even I go crazy. I'm like in all caps, like Azalea hype in chat, like let's do it. It's like she's not that great, right? So I think you're favored. Like if LSS decides to give him any kind of support, we'll have to reevaluate, right? Because it is tough. The Lumina combo is really powerful. It's just like the way to get there right now is a little bit steep. You do have this. This is also really good. You also have Beacon of Victory to also, find it. It's so he does have some consistency. Well, let's see what happens in the future. Until then, you're able to hit him pretty hard. Going on the boost plan is what you're gonna do. So after Boltyn, we have Levia. Now, I don't know. This one's difficult, right? So Levia does have the ability to full block you, and we should point out an insane card where she literally has 6 block on her chest piece. That's pretty big, right? That's a big deal. We just looked at Boltyn, who had, I think he had 4. No, he had 3. He had 3 armor between, even if he blocked the second time with courage, and you have gallantry gold, and she has 6 just on her chest plate, right? She has 2 on the crown, and she has 3 because of battle worn, 2 on the leg pieces. She also does have a high amount of 3 blocks because she is a brute, right? So you do run a risk going full boost into her. However, I do think aggro is probably the way to go. So Levia is going to be setting up these pretty powerful turns, normally with like Art of War and Blood Rush Bellow, having these pretty strong above rate cards. Like here's a 1 for 6. That's pretty good, right? I can't think of too many other decks that have a 1 for 6. Like we have a 1 for 5. That's considered really good. Here's a 2 for 6 with Go again. Does that look familiar, right? So she can actually keep pace with a lot of pretty aggressive strategies. Like here's a 2 for 8. That's pretty insane. But the problem is the blood debt mechanic, right? So she banishes all these cards, they go into her banish zone, and her ability is though she banishes a 6 power or higher every turn, then she turns off the blood debt so she doesn't take damage from it. But she does have the problem where she can brick on a hand that just can't turn off blood debt. And then at that point in the game, much later on, sometimes you'll have about 15 cards, even more sometimes in your blood debt pile, just because you had to banish to play all of your attacks. So sometimes she'll just draw a hand and randomly take 15 from her own mechanic. So if you race her and you make her block with cards, the problem is that eventually, like, the less cards she has, sometimes it becomes much more difficult to turn off blood debt for her. There is an argument that you could just go like full pistol and just choose not to attack her so she can't really fill her graveyard. But there are ways for her to sort of like circumnavigate that. And if the Levia player is experienced and knows what you're doing, I don't think it's going to work out super well for you. So I think going for that is not going to be super effective. And also they just have a way to kind of push through your defenses sometimes, just being, brutes. It's just kind of the nature of the class. So I think racing is perfectly acceptable. You might just want to opt to go induction chamber instead of Teklo, right? Just because even Carrion Husk is insane, right? If you come in with Combustible Courier, even with Goliath Gauntlet and Teklo for 8, they can just put Carrion Husk and Scavskins in front of it and completely block it just on armor. Can't think of a whole lot of other heroes that can do that, except for Chain, right? But Chain's gone, so there's only one Carrion Husk hero left, right? So I think going full Pounder can lead you to some pretty easy fatigue into them. But if you go Induction Chamber, you can grind the game out in the late game, and they're going to have a hard time really keeping it up, especially if they try to race you at any point throughout the game. They're just going to eventually be pressured in a way that's going to require them to sometimes just die to their own mechanics. So Levia does feel even though. I think this is tough. Just because she can block pretty efficiently, right? So it's just gonna be a question of like, can you also outrace her? How well is she gonna be able to draw into Art of War and Blood Rush, right? If she's gonna get there or not. But yeah, I don't know. But also not a super well represented hero, so I wouldn't worry too much about this matchup. So moving on to Dromai. This is tough. This is a tough one. I have no answer. This was my second time recording this video. I recorded it yesterday and I was about an hour in. I didn't even make it this far, and then I realized I was late for an armory. So here I am on the next day re-recording all this. But it is difficult. So there's a couple problems, right? So let's start here. We go full aggro. We just boost them as hard as we can. Well, problem is all the invokes block for 3. Almost every card in this list blocks for 3. You have D-Reacts, you have Erase Face to throw back at them, you have Sand Cover, you even have Sigil in here, you have Skullcap, you have Furnace, you have Tunic, you have Phantasmal Footsteps that block your high octane turns, right? Yeah, they're gonna leak 1 damage, but if they can pitch a blue, or if they can pitch a red and Footsteps and block 4 damage on your high octane turn by re-blocking the Phantasmal Footsteps 4 times, fantastic, right? So if you go full boost, they're going to probably be able to fatigue you almost every single time. So, if that doesn't work, then what's the next option? Well, the next option is we go to this pistol plan, right? Seems kind of good. We can use D-Reacts on some of the bigger dragons, right? Like Kyloria, for instance, comes in for 4, threatens to steal an item. So sick. We get to play a defense reaction to that. Seems pretty good, right? If we set up all these pistol items, we can kill pretty much all these dragons on the table, as even the ones with higher health can still get killed by a couple of pistol shots, right? If we set up, 2 Plasma Purifiers, Mirror Guy goes down, we give it go again, we can shoot something else on the table, right? Here's the problem. On this version, even if you get lucky and you get both induction chambers early, you can only shoot 3 times a turn. So what happens if they stack Ash for a couple of turns and then they play like, let's say early game 2, right? We're talking about late game. Let's say like first couple turns they stack Ash, and then like turn 3, they play like 3 dragons, right? They play like a Necria, they play like a Mirror Guy. Let's say they stack them over a couple turns. You're already in trouble. You already started to hit these board states where like you can't clear them with your pistol alone. And here's the other issue too. Dromai, even through the downside of Phantasm, has a much better board state than Dash because it pressures them the exact same turn. So let's say you play Plasma Purifier, your turn ends, you lose your action point, and then next turn you have to use a card to give your weapon +1. It like doesn't really threaten anything immediately, right? The idea is that like, yeah, it's always there, your opponent really normally can't get rid of it, and it grinds the game out. But think about the difference between that and like Azalea. You play Azalea for 0, he immediately attacks for 3, and if your opponent doesn't have a Phantasm Popper, they have to deal 3 back to it, right? So in that exchange, you're also pressuring them. So the problem is, even if you're like gonna get your induction chambers, right? The Dromai still attacks you in the process. Yeah, you maybe might be able to clear their board state on their turn, but you probably took damage to do it to some degree. And then once the board state gets too wide, right, they get Uvi and you just can't kill it until you find your Purifier. They're gonna make a bunch of Ash Wings, even through Rakes, and they're gonna have this board state that you just cannot interact with. It'll be too wide. You only get 3 pistol shots a turn, and you can boost you can boost the card, but you shouldn't, right, in the early game because of the danger of hitting your pistol items. So it's very difficult. They just have a board state that you're just kind of a lot of trouble interacting with, right? And so it's not good. It's not good. It's not a good time. But I do think the correct option is to bring in your pistol items in some capacity, slot them into the aggro list. You can normally cut perhaps T-bones here and just bring these in, right? And you can go a little bit above 60 so you prevent yourself from fatiguing the same way. Combustible Courier is going to be a really, good card in this matchup. Being able to hit a dragon and then boost into something else and kill it is pretty good when you need to like panic clear the board. You're gonna have maximum velocity payload and throttle as Phantasm Poppers, and you still can go wide with your high octane turns, right? Or you can even use them to clear the board. The nice thing is you can actually fatigue Dromai as her weapon doesn't attack. You can reach a point where she just simply can't actually play anything that threatens damage anymore. She might be able to run out of Ash or will run out of attacks basically. So that is a possibility. So I think I'm leaning more towards siding in these, boosting to some degree when you need to, but still trying to fall back on that pistol plan if you can. Or you could pivot that same strategy, but on the flip side where you're going to full boost into them and then hope that you can find a couple pistol items along the way. So you're able to kind of grind out that late game when normally they would try to fatigue you. But it's not concede. It's close. I've had a lot of problems in this matchup, but also I've been able to win a lot too. So I think it's in rough. It's definitely not easy. That's for sure. I think maybe I'd actually bump up Viserai to maybe even. I think the new version's a little bit easier to keep pace with just because it's a little bit more mid-rangey now instead of being all in on Scaletta stuff. So that's where I would leave this. So next up is Phi. So Phi has a couple of lists. We have the one from the Calling where it was focusing on Kodachi, getting wide combat chains to trigger Rupture very easily. After 2 Kodachis, if they both hit, take the tempo with Threaten to draw a card as well as banish the top card of the deck until next turn if it's an attack action card. You would even have combos where you could play Soaring Strike, reveal Snatch, give Snatch, go again, and then play it. You also have Engulfing Flame Wave, Mounting Anger, and you just have a lot of blue block 3s as well. I think in my opinion it ran too many even bigger than that. I think the iterations I've seen in the list have cut down on that number. You also have Flame Skill, Furnace, Chuko, and Mask Momentum as pretty much a semi-fridge here. So this version was pretty good into aggro decks because of the mass triggers constantly with the Kodachis. Pretty good as a mirror breaker for aggro matchups, especially cards like Take the Tempo and having so many free blocks as well. And then over here we have the more traditional combo style list. We're going to be running Blossom of Spring. We have Searing Ember Blade. We have Mask of the Pouncing Lynx. We also see Spreading Flames and so on. We have Flame Call Awakenings, right? So this one looks a little bit more aggressive than this. For instance, we also have Art of War here as well. Some things do translate over, but this one's focused more on running the 0 cost head jabs, so 0 for 3s, trying to get super wide chains, and then ending with cards like Lava Burst or Salt the Wound. So into both versions, you're pretty much going to be racing. There's pretty much no reason to try to mid-range out these decks. The main reason why is because if you try to mid-range out this list, you have no way to survive the crazy Lynx turns, like the turns where they're gonna, Spreading Flames, Art of War, and deal like 30 damage. If it can kill Oldhim, you're dead, right? Like that version of the deck can actually beat Guardians, and you are nowhere close to being a Guardian deck. So that's a very big issue. So you can't actually survive the aggression of the combo version of Phi. And then because of how strong Kodachis are and how bad they are into a deck like yours, you have no way to actually prevent damage from Kodachi, so they're going to require an entire 3 block from you while still normally leaking damage on the first Kodachi swing. You're just not going to be able to survive, right? It's going to be very difficult. You can come back with a pistol if you want, but they're also pretty comfortable having 2 and 3 blocks into it. So in both versions, you're going to want to be in the boost version and just hope that you're able to hit a little bit of variance. If you're racing Phi, there's a lot of 0 blocks and 2 blocks, so they're not really able to actually fatigue you. But what they will try to do is high roll you before you can high roll them. So cards like Combustible Courier are going to be pretty important in this matchup. You're going to want to start Pounder and you just want to fully go for it. Into the Kodachi version of Phi, you're going to take a gamble, right, when you start Pounder if they're going to be on this version of the deck, because this one does have a lot more 3 blocks and it does have the ability to run defense reaction. So it's up to you whether or not you want to be on Pounder. But I think that into this, even though you are more susceptible to fatigue, there's still ways for you to go wide enough. You're just gonna have to have a lot more reps on the deck and know how to prevent yourself from fatiguing the same way. So because of that, this standard main board is gonna be just enough. And we'll put Fi somewhere in here, probably in the even tier. It can really go either way. It's just gonna be the nature of a lot of aggro mirrors like that. After that, we have Dorinthea. So I just made a video on Dorinthea where I kind of covered how to beat it. Basically, understanding the power turns. The new power turn is going to be a Glistening Steelblade, giving Dawnblade hopefully 3 counters if they're lucky in 1 turn. 3 counters in 1 turn is a pretty big deal. And then to also go beyond that, you're going to have Spoils of War turns. You're going to have your Steelblade Supremacy turns. And then on even more mid-rangey turns, you can go Pitch a Blue, Dawnblade Run Through, Dawnblade for 5, threatening a counter. You can go Warriors Valor Red. So off of blue, you can swing 6 and then threaten to swing another 3, threatening a Dawnblade counter. So that's a pretty big deal. And then you also have cards like Singing Steelblade. So go and actually look at lists like this. I made a video on it, but you should actually go look at one yourself. You can play it on, Talishar if you want, and you can actually try out the deck. You just got to know the blocking patterns of it. Once again, we are pretty lucky because we have so many block 3s. We're able to block these +3 amplifiers pretty cleanly. So even when you know what the cards do, you are pretty lucky because you don't really run 2 blocks. So when they Dawnblade for 3, you can block for 9 with 3 cards, keep a blue, and then pistol back at them. So as I implied, you're going to be on the pistol package. You're going to opt to take out your Combustible Couriers. There's no reason you can't race a deck like this because of them gaining counters from Glistening Steelblade as well as the Dawnblade every turn, and also having so many 3 blocks as well as probably one of the best fridges in Flesh and Blood. It's going to be very easy for them to fatigue you if they want. So you're just not really able to race them. So what you're going to do is you're going to cut out your T-Bones, your Combustible Couriers, and your Maximum Velocities. You maybe even want to cut out your Tekla Pounder as well, just because you really want to lower the amount of non-blocks you have in the deck. And at that point, you're just going to opt to bring in your pistol package. You're going to really be looking to get D-Reacts and Arsenal. Wait for them to Dawnblade, ask for reactions. If they don't attack react, you can then play your defense reaction from Arsenal, completely turn off Reprise and normally shut down their whole turn. Or you can block intelligently with your 3 blocks and then save a defense reaction. And that makes blocking a little bit easier. And then because of that, you're going to be denying Dawnblade from hitting, which means that normally your life total is incredibly high. So when you actually need to take damage to play your pistol items, you're normally able to do it pretty efficiently. Especially when you only need about 2 cards to set up a pistol item, and then you can start blocking for 6 or for 9. They can't get the Dawnblade above it, so then it goes to your turn and you're able to keep a blue and you're able to come back with these weapons. And then what's even better is that late game, you're able to stay no blocks, so be above 30 life. And because so many of these cards actually only have reprise effects, when you actually eventually say no blocks to Dorinthea, she can actually start to lose a lot of her value, for instance. And so you can hit a point where you just say no blocks so you can keep all of your blues or set up your High Octane turn. High Octane works very well in this matchup. And Dorinthea with like 5 cards and you say no blocks is really not able to push a lot of damage. Sometimes she can push like 9 or a little bit higher. We're talking about a 5-card hand, like a 5-card hand that does like maybe 9 or 12 damage. Not very good, especially when you're coming back after setting all these items to the 5-card hand that maybe does like 25 to 30 damage, especially with High Octane. You just outclass them really quickly. So once you get to that late game, you can start ignoring their Dawnblade attacks and you can start keeping all your cards. And even if their Dawnblade's getting counters, eventually you're going to pressure their hand, pressure their life total, pressure the game ending, and they'll have to start blocking all their cards, and then Dawnblade's going to lose counters, and then you just win the game at that point. Especially with 2 and 2, coming down a breakpoint of 4 means that even if they're blocking every single pistol shot, they're leaking a damage every turn. So you win the late game in that matchup. So I would put Dorinthea in favored. You're just able to utilize your 3 blocks, utilize all your defense reactions. You have a very strong end game that you can get to, and you're able to control your life total very, very well until then. I mean, that's the entire point of the deck, or the matchup at least, is controlling your life total by not even letting Dawnblade hit. So now we have Rhinar, an old love of mine. Rhinar is going to be difficult, mainly because you can't necessarily opt to go full boost into him because of the amount of 3 blocks. Now having Scab Skins, Crown, Tunic, they are able to actually block you out pretty well. And if they really want to, they are actually able to fatigue you if they decide to bank on that strategy. And also going full defense on the pistols is a problem because of the amount of intimidates. Rhinar traditionally has worked pretty well into pistol dash. Arc Smash was pretty helpful in the matchup, but it more has to do with the fact that on mid-range dash, you want to be blocking with normally about 2 to 3 cards a turn, and if the Rhinar can intimidate more than twice, then your hand is normally pretty weakened. Or if you're, you know, for instance, on a version like this, right, you don't have as many blues, so sometimes they'll intimidate all of your non-blue cards, so the only card left is a card you would need for the resources for your pistol or to play a pistol item, or they leave you with a non-block item in hand. So there's a problem with that, right? So because of that, the aggro version of the deck normally is going to work better into Rhinar. You're able to race him pretty well. If he intimidates your hand, it doesn't really matter because you're keeping the cards anyway to attack back into him. So yeah, his entire turn might deal 9 damage to you and might triple intimidate you, right? If he like pitches this and discards Massacre. But a 3-card hand that does 9 isn't very good compared to what you can do, right? If you keep a 3-card hand with like Zipper Hit and Throttle, that's a hand that does 11. So you're just kind of winning in that exchange. So you want to race, but you also want to bring an Induction Chamber over Tekla Pounder just so that you don't end up accidentally fatiguing yourself late game. So that's pretty much it. There's not really much you have to look out for here. Just know that they can run a Race Face and CNC, and they can pummel it pretty easily off a Tunic. So maybe opt to not Arsenal as much as you normally would plan on it, and be ready to get blown up by a Race Face and not be able to do anything on your turn. But until then, I think it goes in the even category. Once again, Dash is a mid-range hero, so we probably shouldn't be super surprised that like everything's going to be in the even category. It's just going to kind of be how it is. And then after that, we have Bravo. Very similar to Oldhim. We kind of covered this already. The main difference being that Bravo does not have as much utility on his cards, but normally has much more aggression or has utility in the form of crush effects. So while Oldhim has cards like Hypothermia, Ice React, Earth React, Rampart, CLF, things like that, Endless Winter, Bravo has a lot more raw damage, being able to give things dominate on his ability, and normally having some pretty powerful turns, normally using Zealous Belting and Anothos to go wide, so he can aggro into dash if he wants to. You also run Rousey Ancients, which is a 3 for 7, very powerful card. You also are on the E-Strike plan, and Dominate Crippling Crush is very powerful, right? So just like Oldhim, we're going to be opting to bring in this entire pistol package. The only difference is instead of cutting High Octane, we're going to find ways to leave it in because Bravo does not run the Rampart, so High Octane can actually work very well into him, and he's not actually able to block it the same way that Oldhim is able to block High Octane. So because of that, you're going to cut your maximum velocities, your combustible couriers, your T-bones, but you are going to instead keep your High Octanes in, and you can cut cards like High Speed Impact, right? So it's pretty much going to stay the same. Preserve your life total as best you can, get your pistol items out, and just slowly grind out the game. That's about it. It's much more easy to argue that he's in the favored category because he does not have the same amount of hate for dash that Oldhim does, right? Especially through things like Hypothermia and Channel Lake Frigid, as well as even Endless Winter, or the amount of dominate attacks. While Bravo can dominate a lot of things, they're not coming in for the same numbers that Oldhim's are, right? Like Red Macho Grande. Currently, Bravo's not on Red Macho Grande yet, at least in the list I've seen, but Oldhim is, right? So that's a pretty big difference currently. And now we're at the very end. I am absolutely exhausted. Thank you for watching all this. We finally made it to Katsu. I don't know. This one's tough. Because Katsu, if you say no blocks to Katsu the whole game, you're going to get blown out because of mass momentum. They're going to set up these really powerful combo lines. There are a few in here that you should know about. You should know about the Surging Strike, into Whelming Gust Wave, draw a card, into Mangenchi Release, into Lord of Wind. That's a really powerful line that can normally do like over 20 damage, I think, and I think that's the low end of that. It's probably more. I'm probably just misremembering. I'm tired. It's been a long video. They did get some new tech with cards like Double Strike and Erase, so they are able to mid-range you out a little bit better. They do have a high density of 3 blocks as well, so going full aggro into them is going to be difficult. You do run a risk of fatigue, so it probably would be better to maybe start Induction Chamber here if you really do care about that, especially if they're going to be running cards like Flick Flack and Sink Below. But the pistol version is also going to really struggle because of how efficient Kodachis are. Same reason we argue that Fi's going to have a hard time, or you're going to have a hard time in a Fi, you're going to have a hard time in a Katsu for that same reason. Katsu has so many breakpoints, goes so wide, and is able to pretty much trigger when anything hits. It's just not going to be reasonable for you to effectively block him out while still being able to keep cards to do what you want to do with your pistols. So you're going to want to start Induction Chamber. Get ready to mid-range it out on some turns. Some turns it will be correct just to throw 2 cards, you know, in front of Whelming Gustwave, right? And deny that card draw, deny that mass trigger, and then just play off of 2 cards. And so Induction Chamber makes it a little bit easier for you to play off of sometimes 2 to 3 cards. So you're going to grind it out a little bit better. Just learn some of the combo lines, know when he's out of it, right? If he runs out of Searching Strikes, you're feeling a lot better because he's not able to really set up that same combo line, or especially some of the power cards like Whelming Gustwave. Keep track of Razor Reflexes, know when there's still 1 in the deck, and when you're dead to them. Same goes for Ancestral Empowerment, also a very good card you need to keep in mind. And that's about it. So yeah, that concludes everything. He's definitely in the rough tier. Both strategies are going to struggle into him, and you're just going to have to hope that things kind of work out. So we made it to the end of the video. What have we learned? We've learned that Dash is kind of in a good spot. It's pretty much even into most of the field, which is a really good thing, and probably where you want your hero to be. Has some pretty well-favored matchups, but there is an issue here, and maybe an argument for why maybe you don't want to play her at any of the upcoming events is that two of the heroes in the rough tier are very well represented in the meta currently. Lexi's not too far behind, and the cards in the favorite tier are actually not really popular at all, right? 3 cards in the favored, or 3 heroes in the favorite tiers or above are really only there because the heroes are weak, not because they're not well represented, right? So when you look at Briar, who's probably gonna be one of the most well represented heroes in this upcoming meta, and she's in the rough tier, and Azalea's in free, it probably doesn't seem like the hero's in that good of a spot. The only reason that you could argue you might want to be playing Dash is if you're expecting, you know, Guardians like Bravo and Oldhim, but at that point you might just want to be on Iyslander instead. So if you're doing it for a pure meta call, this might be a good way to kind of evaluate it in the meta currently. But if you just enjoy the hero like I do, this is just a way just to understand where your strengths and weaknesses lie and how you can improve in those matchups. So thank you for watching all this. If you even made it this far, yeah, thank you for watching.